professional and warm welcome. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. And I think I've had the privilege of speaking at this event in the past and other events in the past, and mainly on the topics of what I am seeing and telling stories about other organizations that are on this path to whatever we want to define as Teal. And it's such a privilege that I've been invited this year to talk specifically about the organization that I am helping to co-invent every day, Greater Than. So I'm really, really grateful that out of all of your choices, you chose to be here with us. And there's so much to share, and it was a little bit difficult to actually pick out the elements that I think are different enough to be interesting in terms of what might spark imagination and what could kind of be added to the fodder of the ecosystem for you to take away and experiment with and come back and share. So without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And if hopefully you don't mind if I share it without fully sharing the screen. I find it quite discombobulating when I can't see the slides in the corner. So please bear with me with this and don't judge me too much on my Wordle score, for example. So welcome, co-inventing an organization greater than. So I'm I guess quite unabashedly maybe contrary is too strong of a word, but one of the elements that are that's so strongly in the zeitgeist and here and in these spaces is this idea that purpose is everything, and that if you can't have a clear purpose that everybody can align to with their own purpose, then you're starting on very shaky ground. I've got a pretty strong lived critique of that. And I'm never really quite sure if that's just from my own perspective of my lived experience, or that there's actually something in here that's interesting for us to consider. So at Greater Than, kind of to start off, the idea is that what gathered us around this idea were really more principles and less about purpose. And I'll talk a little bit about why and how that manifests as the story of Greater Than has progressed. So the principles that we first gathered around, can read them here, greater than the sum of our parts. We ground ourselves in the practice. Like, it was very important to us that if we were going to form a company that is going out there and purporting to be able to accompany organizations on a journey to dynamic leadership, less hierarchy, more wholeness at work, that we were actually practicing ourselves. This is an element that's pretty interesting, because it's very easy from just me, using I statements, for me to critique consultancies, agencies, agile shops, for example, that have kind of like glommed onto this as the next interesting thing to monetize because it's in the zeitgeist. But yeah, for me, it's so important to be efficacious by grounding ourselves in the actual practices that we're teaching. Working with power, again, naming power so that we can work with it, staying perpetually curious, and leading with passion, compassion, and authenticity. And so one of the ways that I like to look at this, and it just as I was going through and creating the presentation and just regarding the graphics that we've chosen for representing who we are, purpose is individual. So if we regard this mountain, everybody's going to have a different reason for wanting to get to the top of the mountain. But the fact that we can come together and have this direction and intention that's collective, I think allows us to retain our unique potential while still striving for something great together. And where we sort of orient in greater than, very important to us, again, is this, and this will come as no surprise to any of you who are here at this conference, that systemic change is really dependent not only on reinterrogating and recreating the systemic elements of the organization that we know are no longer serving what we're trying to do in the world, but in order to do that, we need to do our personal change at the same time. So you can't do this without doing this. And so very specifically, we work at the center and the intersection of both organizational change and personal change. And we learned how to do this from our communities. So certainly the founding members, founding partners of Greater Than, and many of our current associates and people in the ecosystem have their grounding in participatory leadership through our communities. In the case of Greater Than, specifically in Spiral and We Share, two communities that have for a decade been practicing collective consent-based decision-making and collective distribution of value and money, and doing governance together and experimenting and creating tools to help us do this in a decentralized way where somebody leads, everybody leads sometimes, but nobody is leading all of the time. And the interesting part is that I think that most of us struggled with the idea that these communities were places for us to build our muscles to be able to do what was coming next. But again, this is another element of purpose. Like, we're here building our muscles, but we really aren't sure at the time that we're building our muscles what those muscles are going to be useful for in future. So in the case of Inspiral, I think Greater Than is my third or fourth company that is sprung from the Inspiral soil. But the difference here, and the reason that it's stuck, is because we'd finally understood that what we were trying to do was come together with a collective intention around the work that we wanted to do, and creating the conditions within Greater Than to reinvent the possibility for a radically good livelihood. And a phrase that I like to use is, yes, it is possible to do work you love with people you love. And for me, that's the most important thing. So going back to this idea of my critique of purpose, or having a purpose up front before we gather, I just thought that this was a really interesting way to look at the conceptually, that if we had really locked in on one thing, would we have failed because we hadn't actually allowed ourselves to have the room to recreate our purpose as we moved? And so the very essence of how Greater Than started, and I was sharing this with Liz yesterday. Sorry, I'm really sorry. I just have to move locations quickly. Was the invitation to take a product that had been developed through the Inspiral network called Co-Budget, and steward that product for its potential in a broader market. So I was on the walk to the cafe that cold morning in November in, I think it must have been 2017, where the seed of the idea of maybe actually we can make a proposal to our community that we move forward stewarding this project Co-Budget. And that was sort of the first purpose of Greater Than, I guess. And it lasted for about a year. And then what started happening was that the expression of what was possible and potential through the group of people that came together started to morph and change. Started to think about cohort-based learning and starting the academy, then transformation accompaniment, doing longer arc commitments with organizations to accompany them on their transformation journey. Then COVID happened, and we found ourselves uniquely placed as a remote first organization to be able to share with others how we can use virtual facilitation to build capacity in everyone in these times to be able to create the conditions, not only for us to continue to participate together, but thrive as much as is possible in an environment where we're no longer easily co-located. Then moving into trauma-informed collaboration. And again, you know, these arcs are all interlinked. The collective trauma that we have experienced throughout the past 2 years with something that's never happened in the world before, and which continues to this day and seems to be ever changing in ways that we couldn't have predicted before. The importance of us as space holders, facilitators, guides, coaches, to be able to recognize and work with trauma just as we work with power has been another sort of arc in the purpose evolution of Greater Than coaching. And most recently, it's super interesting, we're doing lots of ecosystem partnerships. So really moving from that heart intention that this space certainly doesn't need to be a zero-sum competitive game. That there are many other instantiations like Greater Than, complementary to, different, askew, different geographies, slightly different practices that make sense for us to come together and work and collaborate together. And again, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make and can just as easily make differently. And so when we think about how we go about this from the perspective of how we're choosing to be together, you know, this really simplistic self-management onion, right? So everything starts with this commitment to each other that we're going to be in adult to adult relationship with each other and use our personal agency and leadership. And then we've got the principles that guide our actions, as I've talked about in the beginning. And on top of that is this commitment to experiments and transparency, supporting those with our habits and rituals, things like check-ins, feedback, liberating structures, and only then either finding, curating, or creating the tools that can help us do that in a way that allows us to be productive, efficient, communicative, and in relationship in a organization where we span, I think, 8 or 9 different countries and many, many time zones. So if we think about what has been especially significant to us, not only in how we talk about the work that we do in the world, but what's been important to us as Greater Than to be focusing on as we're building and co-inventing this organization, are the ideas around how we cultivate relationships, of course, agreements and communication and roles and decision making. And all of these things should be familiar to anybody who's been experimenting or living in this space. There are many, many good practices. No such thing as best practice, but really going back to the onion is that we're only really able to see what is going to be in support of what we're trying to do after we've worked together for a while. So again, none of this stuff is baked up front, but these are elements that we pay attention to as we go to see what's emerging. What patterns are we noticing? What's working? What are the experiments doing? What is worth amplifying? What should we be dampening? And really being in that space of avoiding what I, in my most passionate moments, you know, borrowing Frederick's language about this rational masculine compulsion to codify everything, right? This idea that if we codify it, we can share it, and the same thing will happen because we've done our work and we kind of know that this is the framework. We know in our hearts and through our experience, it doesn't work that way, right? We have tools, we have scaffolding, but what emerges in the middle, from the middle, only emerges with time and with practice. So again, just reinforcing the idea, not only the idea, but the reality that one of our jobs is, I think, when we're trying to create something together, is to restrain ourselves from this compulsion to, I don't even know what the right word is, to follow something before we're ready. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. And so just want to give you a couple of examples that aren't related to the common themes that we have around decision making or roles and accountabilities or agreements necessarily, but to share with you some of the really neat things that we've done in terms of relationships and relating to the whole. So if we think about what greater than is, there's kind of three nested holes of how you can relate to greater than. So we've got this idea of partnerships where greater than is my professional home. Almost all of my work is done through and with greater than colleagues. And this is where I'm really investing my building energy as well. Associates, people that work occasionally on greater than projects, but are really committed to helping this building effort. And then anybody else, people who are really interested in what we're trying to do, are contributing when they can, and are kind of just feeling their way into the water. I just wanted to share a couple of examples and talk a little bit about how this happens. So unlike most organizations, we don't hire people, there aren't any job, there aren't any roles. There isn't a case of applying to be a member of greater than, right? It's really about sensing into yourself where your commitment is for this season. And so one of the things that we do every year in September is we give everybody in the system an opportunity to really think about where they want to be in the next year and how they want to contribute. And I think this is pretty cool, like the way that that we've done it the last couple of years. So it's not important to read what's in the sticky notes, but if you can imagine, this was in a mural board. Everybody chose an icon to represent them. And as we were stepping in to be warmed by the fire, we made our commitments. And the way that evolved last year was this metaphor of jumping into the river. So again, had our little icons representing us. And as we really sunk into where our commitment was for this next year, we moved our icon to the place in the river that best expressed where we wanted to be and told a story about it. So again, very, very unique, specific, interesting ways that we're relating to the system that I don't think you'll find in many other organizations. And really what this is all based on is nurturing this proposal-based culture and practice, really, really living into the practice of default to yes, and people really paying attention to where their energy is, what they want to offer, and what they want to be responsible and accountable for. And another big differentiator, I think, is, going back to my friend Alana Irving, these are her words, and it echoes in my mind constantly. If it's not documented, it's not open source. So in a moment, I'll put the link to that book. Anybody can put it in handbook.greaterthan.works. And you can basically go there and find and see every single agreement we have, all of our practices, our history, how we do governance, et cetera, et cetera. And the hope is, and like the light prayer is, that people will take what we've learned, fork it, and make it theirs. Another really interesting practice that you will have seen on a previous slide is this idea of how we interact with money. And again, a unique in the world way that Greater Than has chosen to work with money internally is from an inspiration by Charles Davis' Happy Money Story. So just give you an example here. So let's just say that we're working together on a project. And at the end of, let's just say that it's a 3-month project. And we come together at the end of the first month and tell each other stories about what happened that month, right? Tell each other stories about, well, coming into this, I thought that my contribution would be this, and it actually ended up being this. And I wasn't sure how Claudia was going to interact, but I really noticed her stepping in and filling the gaps when this didn't happen, or Liz was off sick for a week. And so the idea is many times, and and again, this is personal experience and feelings of being misunderstood or conflicted about money distribution, where some even progressive organizations might approach a project where they upfront say, right, this is going to be my contribution to the project. This is the hourly rate, or I feel like I really don't want to do this for less than $5,000. And this is what I commit to doing. And then at the end of the project, or midway through the project, or whenever the distribution of money happens, it's always the case that upfront, I guess, like standing up for yourself or being clear on your needs doesn't really reflect what actually manifests in the project. I've got an example of I facilitated an in-person workshop a couple years ago, where one of the co-hosts did this and said, like, I'm not going to do this for less than what X amount of money. And we ended up not selling the number of tickets that we wanted, and our overheads and costs were more. So this person at the end ended up getting, I don't know, $2,000, and I ended up getting like 200. Right. So again, these are practices and experiences that have led us to really exploring how in an emergent, complex work environment, we can really work with patterns and noticing the emergent qualities, being able to reflect in retrospect, and then having the value reflect what actually happened. So just very quickly in practice, the way that this works is, you can see everybody has got a tab for their proposal. We tell each other stories. We go into our tab. We make our personal proposals for how we think the money should be distributed. Then I'll come back together on this sheet. We can see what everybody's proposed, have further clarifying questions and conversations, and then eventually one person's story or an amalgamation of the stories bubbles up as to something we can all feel happy about. And this is the key. It's not about, is this fair? I mean, sure, part of it is this fair? Does this represent what happened? But it's like, does this make me happy in my heart? Right? And the other thing that it allows us to do is really lean into what are the particular needs in the time. Like, if I'm very healthy in cash flow one month, and I know that Pierre Michel is waiting for a check from a client that hasn't paid in 3 months, absolutely, that will fall into and wrap into the money stories, so that we're really being able to reflect what happened, our needs, and what makes us happy. Other things that are very important to the evolution of Greater Than is the concept of invitations, experiments, and seasons. Invitations, for example. So every month we host spaces that are just, opportunities for people to come and share together, to work out loud, to reflect out loud. And every year we have, well, this will be our second year, this idea of the Solstice Jamboree, where for 6 weeks, anybody in the broader ecosystem can bring their gift to one place, where we are able, over a longer arc, and, learning from experiences like Teal around the world that are kind of short and compressed. The idea in the experiment was, what if we took a 6-week arc here, and maybe we had 2 things a day or 3 things every 2 days, to see what could happen, not only to offer a space for people that we love and trust to come and bring their gifts, but to, spread the word and see what happens over a longer arc. And I feel really fortunate that we have the opportunity to do these experiments almost on behalf of the ecosystem, and then share back what we're learning. Recent innovations. Yeah, Liz, I'm getting there. Cool. How much longer?
Just a couple of minutes.
Just a couple of minutes, right? As soon as you can. So recent innovations might seem a little bit obscure, from heartbeat teams to initiative hikes. One thing that we've done is, again, now we've found that it's time to start identifying budgeting the persistent roles that are really proving valuable to our space. So things like having an open books guardian and somebody who's the first responder, having a people dashboard, which is really cool, an open books project. And then this is another thing that we're exploring with what does a circular calendar of seasons look like? So that rather than the traditional Gantt chart, we're like sensing into when are our breaks, when are our pauses, when do we all come together? What are some of the persistent seasonal things that we can look forward to? Some of the things that we're noticing in the system that are helping us see what's healthy and maybe what needs attention. So our Slack is super healthy, it's super active. Our weekly newsletter gets a lot of positive engagement. The Academy courses are maturing. Our minimum viable board, which could be a whole other talk, is something that's really vibrant and doing what it needs to do. Our rhythms are good. You know, the plus and minus is the capacity and time zone, right? We are in a very abundant state with what we're able to do, but it's always a compromise in time zones. And I just wanted to add this little funny thing that somebody posted in our Slack is like, this is the reality of greater than. So schedule a meeting, reschedule a meeting, and then finally get to do the work. And of course, the thing that's hard is that we haven't met in person in 2 years, which hopefully, fingers crossed, and the tide doesn't rise too much, we're going to be able to do in June. What we still need to figure out, and I've got some ideas, new things are popping up all the time. And again, it just comes back to how we organize changes everything. And it's around these elements that we all know and love.